The morning started like any other Tuesday in Riverside, a sleepy town tucked away in the Pennsylvania hills where nothing exciting ever happened and folks preferred it that way. Marcus Webb was already 3 cups of coffee deep into his shift at Henderson's Gas and Grocery when he noticed something weird going down across the street. Real weird. The kind of weird that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up like soldiers at attention. Some dude was stumbling around the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, moving all jerky and wrong, like a puppet with half its strings cut. Marcus squinted through the grimy window, watching as the guy lurched toward old Mrs. Patterson, who was probably heading in for her usual breakfast special. Marcus had worked the early morning shift for 6 years straight, ever since dropping out of community college to help his mom with bills, and he'd seen plenty of drunks, junkies, and all sorts of characters rolling through this nowhere town. But this was different. The way that dude moved wasn't natural, wasn't human somehow. He grabbed his cell phone, thinking maybe he should call Sheriff Daniels, when Mrs. Patterson started screaming. Not the kind of scream you hear when someone's startled or annoyed, but a real horror movie, blood-curdling scream that cut through the quiet morning like a chainsaw through butter. "Holy crap," Marcus muttered, his coffee cup freezing halfway to his lips. The stumbling dude had grabbed Mrs. Patterson, and even from across the street, Marcus could see something was seriously messed up. The guy's skin looked gray, almost greenish in the early light, and the way he was moving on her, it looked like he was trying to bite her. Actually bite her, like some kind of animal. Marcus's brain couldn't process what his eyes were showing him. This was Riverside, for crying out loud. The most exciting thing that happened here was when the high school football team made it to regionals. He fumbled for the phone, his hands shaking so bad he almost dropped it. Before he could dial, his coworker Jenny burst through the back door, her face pale as a ghost and her eyes wide with panic. "Marcus, you gotta see what's on the news, man. You gotta see this right now." She was breathing hard, like she'd just run a marathon, and her voice had that edge to it that people get when everything's gone sideways. "I'm kinda busy watching someone get attacked across the street," Marcus shot back, still glued to the window. But Jenny grabbed his arm, yanking him toward the tiny break room where an old TV was mounted on the wall. The news was on, and what Marcus saw made his blood run cold. Every channel, every single one, was showing the same thing. Chaos. Pure, unfiltered chaos. Cities burning, people running and screaming, and those things, those stumbling, jerky things that looked like people but weren't, chasing them down. The news anchor, some woman from Philadelphia who usually looked cool as a cucumber, was barely holding it together. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the fear in her eyes as she read from the teleprompter, her voice cracking every few words. "We're receiving reports from across the eastern seaboard of what authorities are calling a rapidly spreading contagion. Citizens are advised to stay indoors, lock all doors and windows, and avoid contact with anyone showing symptoms of infection. Symptoms include extreme aggression, loss of cognitive function, and..." She paused, like she couldn't believe what she was about to say. "And an apparent compulsion to bite or attack others." "This can't be real," Marcus said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was. He'd just seen it with his own eyes across the street. Jenny was already grabbing supplies off the shelves, stuffing candy bars, water bottles, and batteries into her backpack with shaking hands. "We gotta get out of here, Marcus. We gotta go now." "But where?" That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? Marcus's mind raced through options like shuffling cards. His mom's place was 20 minutes away on the edge of town. His buddy Jake's apartment was closer, just a few blocks up Main Street. Or they could stay put, lock the doors, and wait this thing out. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked. Maybe the authorities would get it under control. Even as he thought it, he knew he was being stupid. Nothing about this looked under control. The decision got made for them when the front door chimed, that cheerful little bell they'd all heard 1,000 times suddenly sounding creepy as hell. Marcus turned, expecting to see a customer, maybe someone looking for answers or safety. Instead, 3 of those things shuffled through the door. They'd been people once, maybe an hour ago, maybe that morning. Now they were something else. Their clothes were torn and bloody, their skin that same awful gray-green color, and their eyes were empty, dead, like looking into a void. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," Jenny was chanting behind him, backing toward the storage room. Marcus grabbed the baseball bat he kept under the counter for robberies that never happened in sleepy Riverside and held it in front of him like a sword. His hands were sweating so bad he could barely keep his grip. The things moved toward them, making these sounds, these low groans that raised every primitive alarm in Marcus's brain. "Storage room, now!" Marcus shouted, and Jenny didn't need to be told twice. They bolted, Marcus swinging the bat wild as one of those things reached for him. He connected with its shoulder, heard something crack, but it didn't even slow down. It didn't feel pain, didn't react like a person should. That's when the reality really hit him. These weren't people anymore. Whatever they'd been, whatever made them human, was gone. They crashed through the storage room door and slammed it shut behind them, Marcus throwing his weight against it as the things on the other side started pounding. The door was solid metal, thank God, installed after a break-in 3 years back. It would hold. For now. Jenny was already on her phone, trying to call someone, anyone, but the network was jammed. Everyone in the world was probably trying to do the same thing. "There's a back exit," Marcus gasped, pointing to the emergency door on the far wall. "We can get to my truck, get out of town." Where they'd go after that, he had no clue, but staying here was suicide. The pounding on the door was getting louder, more insistent, and he could hear more of those things shuffling around in the store. How many were out there now? 5? 10? More? They pushed through the back exit into an alley that smelled like old garbage and worse things. Marcus's truck was parked at the far end, his beautiful, beat-up Ford F-150 that he'd bought with his own money and babied like it was made of gold. Never thought he'd be so happy to see that rusty piece of junk. They ran for it, their footsteps echoing off the brick walls, and Marcus had his keys out before they even got close. That's when he saw Jake. His best friend since 3rd grade, the guy who'd had his back through every stupid decision and bad idea, was stumbling out from behind a dumpster. Marcus's heart soared for about half a second before he realized something was wrong. Jake's shirt was torn, soaked with blood, and his face had that same gray tint. His eyes, usually bright and full of that troublemaker sparkle, were empty and dead. "No," Marcus breathed, the word barely a whisper. "No, man, not you." Jake's head turned toward the sound of his voice, and a low moan escaped his throat. He started moving toward them with that horrible, jerky shuffle, his hands reaching out. Marcus raised the bat, but his arms felt like lead. This was Jake. They'd played Little League together, gotten detention together, talked about getting out of this dead-end town together. How could he? "Marcus, we gotta go." Jenny screamed, already at the truck. The sound snapped him out of it. He turned and ran, leaving Jake, or what used to be Jake, stumbling after them. Marcus's hands shook so bad he could barely get the key in the ignition, but the old Ford roared to life like she'd been waiting for this moment. He threw it in reverse and gunned it, not looking back, couldn't look back. They tore out of the alley and onto Main Street, and what Marcus saw made him want to puke. Riverside was falling apart. The quiet little town where nothing ever happened was pure chaos now. People were running everywhere, screaming, trying to get to their cars or their homes. Those things were everywhere too, coming out of houses, stores, crawling out of wrecked cars. It was like watching his whole world crumble in real time. "Where are we going?" Jenny asked, her voice small and scared. "Good question." Marcus's mind was racing faster than the truck's engine. His mom's place? No, she lived in a neighborhood, too many people, too many of those things probably. They needed somewhere isolated, somewhere they could defend. Then it hit him. "My uncle's cabin," he said, taking a hard right that made the truck's tires squeal. "Up in the hills, about 40 minutes from here. Nobody goes up there except during hunting season." His uncle Raymond had bought the place years ago, used it maybe twice a year. It was basic, just a one-room cabin with a wood stove and an outhouse, but it was isolated. Right now, isolated sounded perfect. Getting out of town was like driving through hell's parking lot. Marcus had to swerve around abandoned cars, people running into the street, and those things stumbling everywhere. Once, he had to plow right through two of them that were blocking the road. The truck shuddered with the impact, and Marcus tried not to think about what he'd just done, tried not to think about the fact that those things used to be people. Jenny was crying silently beside him, staring at her phone like it might suddenly start working and tell her this was all some crazy prank. "My mom's in Pittsburgh," she said quietly. "She was visiting my aunt. I can't reach her. I can't reach anyone." Marcus didn't know what to say to that. What could anyone say? "Sorry, the world's ending and we can't find your mom?" Everything that seemed important yesterday, bills and work schedules and all that normal life stuff, didn't mean squat now. They hit the edge of town, and Marcus pushed the truck harder, taking the old highway that snaked up into the hills. Behind them, Riverside was burning. He could see smoke rising in his rearview mirror, black columns against the morning sky. How had everything gone to hell so fast? This morning he'd been worried about covering Jenny's shift next week and whether he could afford new tires. Now he was running for his life from things that shouldn't exist. The radio was pure static and panic. Marcus flipped through stations, catching fragments of broadcasts. Martial law declared in major cities. Evacuation centers being established. Avoid all contact with infected individuals. Shoot on sight orders. That last one made him grip the wheel tighter. Shoot on sight. They were really doing this. This wasn't some temporary thing that would blow over. This was the real deal, the actual end of the world. They'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes when they hit traffic. Not normal traffic, but a complete standstill of cars trying to flee the city. People had abandoned their vehicles and were just running, carrying whatever they could grab. Marcus pulled off the highway onto an old logging road he'd used a million times when he and Jake would go riding. The thought of Jake made his chest tight, but he pushed it down. Couldn't think about that now. Had to focus on surviving. The logging road was rough, full of potholes and fallen branches, but the truck handled it like a champ. They climbed higher into the hills, leaving the chaos behind, at least for now. The morning sun was higher now, shining through the trees like this was just another beautiful day in Pennsylvania. Birds were singing, completely oblivious to the fact that the human world was tearing itself apart below. "You think it's everywhere?" Jenny asked quietly. "The whole country? The whole world?" Marcus had been wondering the same thing. The news had mentioned the eastern seaboard, but what about the rest? Was California dealing with this? Was Texas? Were his cousins in Florida okay? No way to know, not with the phones down and the internet probably crashed. "Don't know," he admitted. "But right now, we gotta worry about us. We get to the cabin, we hole up, we wait and see what happens." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all he had. They passed a few houses on the way up, mostly summer places that sat empty this time of year. Marcus made mental notes of each one. Might need to scavenge supplies later, if things got really bad. When things got really bad, he corrected himself. No point pretending anymore. The cabin appeared through the trees like a gift from God. It looked exactly like Marcus remembered, a small log structure with a green metal roof and a porch that sagged a little on one side. Uncle Raymond wasn't winning any home improvement awards, but the place was solid. Marcus parked the truck behind the cabin, out of sight from the road, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening after the chaos of the morning. They sat there for a moment, both of them trying to process what had happened in the last couple of hours. This morning they'd been normal people with normal problems. Now they were refugees running from monsters. Jenny broke the silence first. Is this real? Tell me this isn't really happening. Marcus wanted to tell her it was all a nightmare, that they'd wake up and laugh about the crazy dream they'd had. But the blood on his shirt from when one of those things had grabbed him was real. The ache in his arms from swinging the bat was real. The image of Jake's empty eyes was real, burned into his brain forever. It's real, he said quietly. But we're alive, and we're gonna stay that way. He said it with more confidence than he felt, but Jenny needed to hear it. Hell, he needed to hear it. They got out of the truck and approached the cabin carefully. Marcus had the bat ready, just in case, but the place was empty. Dust covered everything, and it smelled like old wood and mouse droppings, but it was shelter. It was safe. The cabin was basic, just like he remembered. One main room with a bed, a table, and a wood stove. A tiny kitchen area with a hand pump for water from the well. No electricity, no internet, no phone service. A few weeks ago, this place would have seemed like a prison. Now it looked like paradise. They did a quick inventory of supplies. Uncle Raymond kept the place stocked for hunting season, so there were canned goods, bottled water, a first aid kit, and best of all, a gun safe. Marcus knew the combination. Uncle Raymond had made him memorize it years ago when he'd brought him up here to teach him to shoot. His hands shook as he worked the dial, but it clicked open. Inside was a hunting rifle, a shotgun, and a handgun, plus several boxes of ammunition. Marcus had never been a gun nut, had actually thought the whole thing was kind of silly when his uncle insisted he learn. Now he wanted to kiss the old man for his paranoia. You know how to use those? Jenny asked, eyeing the guns nervously. Marcus nodded. He wasn't an expert marksman or anything, but he could shoot straight enough. Uncle Raymond had made sure of that. They loaded the weapons and set them around the cabin where they could grab them quick if needed. It felt surreal, like they were in some action movie instead of real life. Night was falling, and with it came a whole new kind of fear. The cabin had shutters on the windows, old heavy things that Uncle Raymond insisted on keeping even though they were a pain. Now Marcus blessed every stubborn bone in the old man's body as he secured them shut. They built a small fire in the wood stove, just enough for warmth and to heat up some canned soup. Neither of them was really hungry, but they needed to eat, needed to keep their strength up. They sat at the old wooden table, eating soup that tasted like cardboard, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made them jump. Were those things out there? Could they track them this far? How long did it take for someone to turn after getting bit? Questions swirled through Marcus's mind like a tornado, and he had answers for exactly none of them. What do you think happened? Jenny asked, breaking the silence. Like, what caused this? Virus? Chemical weapon? Something worse? Marcus had been wondering the same thing. The news hadn't given any real answers before everything went dark. Maybe they didn't know either. Maybe nobody knew. Does it matter? He replied. Knowing what caused it won't change what's happening. Jenny nodded, but he could see she was struggling. They all were. How do you process the end of the world? How do you wrap your brain around the fact that everything you knew, everything you planned for, was just gone? They decided to take shifts sleeping, just to be safe. Marcus took first watch, sitting by the window with the rifle across his lap, peering through the slats in the shutters at the dark forest beyond. The moon was almost full, casting everything in silver light that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now it just made the shadows look deeper, more menacing. Hours crawled by like wounded animals. Marcus's eyes burned from lack of sleep and stress, but every time they started to close, he'd jerk awake, convinced he'd heard something. Around 3 in the morning, he actually did hear something. Footsteps, definitely footsteps, crunching through the fallen leaves outside. His heart hammered against his ribs as he gripped the rifle tighter, trying to see through the darkness. A figure emerged from the tree line, stumbling and jerky. One of them had found the cabin. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he watched it shuffle closer, drawn by something, maybe the faint smell of wood smoke from the stove. It bumped against the porch railing, knocked over an old flower pot, and kept coming. Marcus raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel at the thing that used to be a person. His finger tensed on the trigger, but he didn't shoot. The sound would just attract more of them. Instead, he watched, barely breathing, as the thing wandered around the porch for a few minutes before stumbling back into the woods. It hadn't tried to get in, didn't seem to know they were there. That was good. That was information they could use. When Jenny woke up to take her shift, Marcus collapsed onto the bed without even taking his shoes off. He was asleep before his head hit the pillow, falling into dark dreams full of gray faces and empty eyes. He woke to sunlight streaming through the cracks in the shutters and the smell of coffee. Jenny had found Uncle Raymond's old percolator and figured out how to use it on the wood stove. "Morning," she said, handing him a cup. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, but alive. They were both alive, and that was something. "Anything happened during your watch?" Marcus asked. Jenny shook her head. "Quiet as a graveyard. Maybe they haven't spread this far yet. Maybe. Or maybe they were just lucky." Marcus wasn't counting on luck holding out forever. They needed a real plan, something more than just hiding and hoping. He pulled out an old map of the area that Uncle Raymond kept in a drawer. There were a few other cabins scattered through these hills, a ranger station about 10 miles north, and a small town called Millbrook about 15 miles west. "We need to know what's going on out there," Marcus said, tracing routes on the map. "If the government's got evacuation centers set up, if there are other survivors organizing. We can't just sit here blind." Jenny looked uncertain. "What if it's worse out there? What if we're safer just staying put?" She had a point, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that isolation, while safe in the short term, was a death sentence long term. They had maybe 2 weeks of food in the cabin, a month if they rationed hard. Then what? They couldn't hunt, the gunshots would attract those things. Couldn't go into town for supplies. They'd starve slowly and safely. "We scout," he decided. "Careful, quiet. Hit one of the nearby cabins, see if there's supplies, maybe a radio or phone that works. Get information. Then we decide our next move." It was risky, but sitting still felt riskier somehow. Jenny nodded slowly. She didn't like it, he could tell, but she didn't have a better idea either. They spent the morning preparing. Marcus loaded the truck with supplies in case they needed to run, made sure all the weapons were ready. They ate a good meal, knowing they might not get another chance for a while. Then, around noon when the sun was high and they could see clearly, they headed out. The nearest cabin was about 2 miles down the logging road. Marcus drove slow, windows down, listening for any sound that didn't belong. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Like everything with a brain had enough sense to hide. That silence made Marcus's skin crawl worse than any sound could have. The cabin came into view, a bigger place than Uncle Raymond's, with fancy solar panels on the roof and a satellite dish. Rich folks from the city who came up here to pretend they were roughing it. The truck rolled to a stop about 50 yards out, and Marcus killed the engine. They sat for a full 5 minutes, just watching and listening. Nothing moved. No signs of life, or unlife. "Stay close," Marcus whispered, grabbing the shotgun. Jenny had the handgun, and she held it like it might bite her, but at least she had it. They approached the cabin carefully, every sense on high alert. The front door was slightly open, swinging gently in the breeze. Not a good sign. Marcus pushed it open with the barrel of the shotgun, ready for anything. The inside of the cabin was trashed. Furniture overturned, stuff scattered everywhere, and blood. Not a lot, but enough to tell a story. Someone had been here when things went bad. Someone had tried to defend themselves. Whether they'd succeeded or not, there was no way to know. They searched quickly, grabbing anything useful. The solar panels meant the lights still worked, and incredibly, there was a radio. Marcus turned it on, and after a moment of static, a voice came through. An automated emergency broadcast. Citizens are advised to proceed to the nearest designated safe zone. Military personnel are establishing secure perimeters in the following locations. The voice rattled off a list of places. Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Philadelphia. All cities, all far away. Nothing about small towns or rural areas. They were on their own out here. But then another voice cut through, not automated, a real person. This is Captain Patricia Morrison of the Pennsylvania National Guard broadcasting to any survivors in the central region. If you can hear this, we've established a secure facility at the old Morrison Airfield outside of Millbrook. We have food, medical supplies, and fortified defenses. If you can reach us safely, we're here. Repeat, Morrison Airfield, Millbrook. Broadcasting on this frequency every hour. Stay alive out there, folks. Marcus and Jenny looked at each other. Millbrook. That was the town he'd seen on the map, maybe 15 miles from here. 15 miles through who knew what kind of danger, but 15 miles to safety, to other people, to maybe some answers about what the hell was happening to the world. What do you think? Jenny asked. Marcus studied the map he'd brought with him, tracing the route. It was doable, mostly back roads through the hills. They could take it slow, careful. Or they could stay at the cabin, alone and isolated until the food ran out. I think we gotta try, he said finally. The decision to head for Morrison Airfield felt both right and terrifying at the same time, like jumping off a cliff and hoping there was water below instead of rocks. Marcus and Jenny loaded up the truck with everything useful they could scavenge from the fancy cabin: canned food, bottled water, a better first aid kit than the basic one at Uncle Raymond's place, and even a portable CB radio that might come in handy. The solar panels had kept the place running, which meant they could charge their dead phones even though the networks were down. At least they'd have flashlights if nothing else. Marcus took one last look around the trashed cabin, wondering what had happened to the people who owned it, wondering if they'd made it to safety or if they were stumbling around out there with empty eyes and gray skin like Jake. He pushed the thought away and focused on the now, on survival, on getting him and Jenny to that airfield alive. They decided to move at first light the next morning, use the whole day for travel so they wouldn't get caught out after dark. Neither of them said it out loud, but the night scared them more than anything. Those things were bad enough in daylight when you could see them coming, but in the dark, with just the moon and shadows, that was nightmare fuel. They spent the rest of that day back at Uncle Raymond's cabin, planning their route, checking weapons, trying to prepare for every scenario they could think of. What if the roads were blocked? What if they ran into a horde of those things? What if the airfield was already overrun by the time they got there? Marcus tried to have answers ready, but the truth was they were making this up as they went along, two regular people trying to survive something that shouldn't exist outside of horror movies. That night, Marcus barely slept. He kept thinking about the broadcast, about Captain Morrison's voice cutting through the static with hope and the promise of safety. It could be a trap, his paranoid brain whispered. Could be raiders or worse, luring survivors in. But what choice did they have? Stay hidden until they starved, or take the risk and maybe find other people, safety, answers. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that were way too pretty for the end of the world, Marcus was already up and ready to go. Jenny looked rough when she stumbled out of the cabin, her hair a mess and her face pale, but she had that determined set to her jaw that Marcus had seen before when she dealt with drunk idiots at the gas station. She was scared, they both were, but she wasn't going to let it stop her. They loaded into the truck, Marcus behind the wheel and Jenny riding shotgun with the actual shotgun across her lap, and pulled out onto the logging road as the sun climbed higher. The first few miles were quiet, almost peaceful if you ignored the whole apocalypse thing. The truck rumbled along the dirt road, kicking up dust, while the forest rolled by on either side. Marcus kept the speed low, watching for any movement, any sign of danger. They passed a few abandoned cars, doors left open like their owners had bailed in a hurry, but no bodies, no blood, no zombies. That should have been comforting, but it just made Marcus more nervous. Where was everybody? They got their answer about an hour into the drive when they had to slow down for a curve in the road. A whole group of those things, maybe 20 or 30 of them, were shuffling along the highway below. They must have been from Riverside or one of the other small towns in the area, just wandering now with no purpose except to find living flesh. Marcus held his breath as they drove past on the higher elevation, praying none of them would look up and spot the truck. The zombies, because that's what they were, even if saying it out loud felt crazy, just kept shuffling along like the world's worst parade. "Oh man," Jenny whispered, her knuckles white where she gripped the shotgun. "There's so many of them." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. Seeing one or two of those things was bad enough, but a whole horde like that? If they got surrounded by numbers like that, guns wouldn't matter. They'd be overwhelmed in seconds. He pressed the gas a little harder once they were past, putting distance between them and the dead. They were maybe halfway to Millbrook when they spotted the other survivors. A small group, for people, holed up in a farmhouse that was surrounded by zombies. Marcus could see them in the second-story windows, waving frantically, desperate for help. He slowed the truck, his conscience and his survival instinct going to war in his head. Helping them was the right thing to do, the human thing, but it was also risky as hell. There had to be at least a dozen zombies around that farmhouse, and making noise to draw them away would just attract more. "We gotta help them," Jenny said, reading his mind. She was right, and Marcus knew it, even if every survival instinct he had was screaming to keep driving. He looked at the farmhouse, at the people waving, and made a decision he hoped wouldn't get them all killed. "Okay, here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna lay on the horn, draw those things away from the house. When they follow, I'll lead them down the road, circle back, and pick everyone up. You stay in the truck, keep the engine running, and if this goes sideways, you drive away. You get to that airfield, you hear me?" "Marcus, no way am I," Jenny started, but he cut her off. "No arguments. One of us needs to survive this, tell people what happened. That's you." Before she could protest more, he laid on the horn, the sound cutting through the quiet morning like a knife. Every zombie head turned toward the truck, and they started moving, shuffling faster than Marcus would have thought possible, drawn by the noise like moths to a flame. Marcus pulled away slowly, keeping just ahead of them, drawing the horde away from the farmhouse. His heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. There had to be more than he'd initially counted, maybe 15 or 20 of the things, all focused on the truck now, reaching out with gray hands and moaning that awful sound that made his skin crawl. He led them a good quarter-mile down the road before cutting across a field, the truck bouncing over rough ground, then circling back toward the farmhouse from a different direction. The people inside had seen what he was doing and were already on the move. As Marcus pulled up, they came running out, a middle-aged couple, a young guy who looked college-aged, and a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. They piled into the truck bed, and Marcus didn't waste time with introductions. He gunned it, tires spinning in the dirt, as the zombie horde realized they'd been tricked and started shambling back toward the farmhouse. "Go, go, go," the college-aged guy was yelling from the back, pounding on the roof of the cab. Marcus was already pushing the truck as hard as he dared on the rough terrain. They bounced back onto the road, and he took off toward Millbrook, checking the rear view to make sure they weren't being followed. The zombies were already fading into the distance, too slow to keep up with the truck. They'd made it. Somehow, they'd actually pulled it off. A few miles down the road, Marcus pulled over so everyone could catch their breath and sort themselves out. The 4 people they'd rescued climbed out of the truck bed, looking rough but alive. The middle-aged man stepped forward, extending his hand. "Name's Robert Fitzgerald. This is my wife Linda, and these are our kids, Tyler and Emma. You just saved our lives, man. We've been trapped in that farmhouse for 2 days." Marcus shook his hand, feeling the weight of what they'd just done settling on his shoulders. For more lives depending on them getting to safety. Marcus Webb. This is Jenny. We're heading to Morrison Airfield outside Millbrook. Heard a broadcast saying there's a safe zone there. Robert's face lit up with hope. We heard that too, before our radio died. You got room for all of us? We'll make room, Marcus said, because what else could he say? Leave them on the side of the road? They were all in this together now, for better or worse. Everyone piled into the truck, cramped and uncomfortable, but nobody complained. Alive and uncomfortable beat dead every single time. As they got moving again, Linda started crying quietly, just letting the stress and fear of the last 2 days pour out. Her husband held her, whispering that they were okay now, they were safe, even though nobody really knew if that was true. Tyler, the college kid, leaned forward from the back seat. How bad is it out there? We've been cut off, no news, no information. Just those things trying to get in. Marcus filled them in on what little they knew. The outbreak, the chaos in the cities, the evacuation centers, the whole world going to hell in a handbasket. Tyler listened with wide eyes, and Emma just stared out the window like she was in shock. Couldn't blame her. This was a lot for a kid to process. They were about 5 miles from Millbrook when they hit their first real problem. The bridge they needed to cross was out, not destroyed but blocked by a massive pileup of cars and trucks. People had tried to evacuate, probably all heading for the same airfield, and they created a traffic jam that turned into a death trap. The cars were empty now, doors hanging open, and Marcus didn't want to think about what had happened to all those people. We gotta find another way across, Robert said, studying the river below. It wasn't huge, but it was too deep and fast to ford with the truck. Marcus pulled out his map, tracing the river with his finger. There was another bridge, but it was 10 miles south, which would add at least an hour to their trip, maybe more. Or they could try the old rail bridge about a mile upstream. It hadn't been used in years, and Marcus had no idea if it was even still standing, but it would save them time if it was passable. The rail bridge, Marcus decided. We're burning daylight, and I don't want to be out here after dark. Nobody argued. They backtracked and found the overgrown trail that led to the old rail line. The bridge was still there, thank God, a rusty metal structure that had seen better days but looked solid enough. The problem was it was built for trains, not trucks. The tracks were too narrow, but there was a maintenance walkway on the side, wooden planks laid across metal supports. No way that'll hold the truck, Jenny said, and she was right. But it might hold people. Marcus stared at the bridge, at the river below, at the sun getting lower in the sky, and made another call. We cross on foot. Take what we can carry, weapons and supplies, and we hoof it the rest of the way to Millbrook. It's only a few miles from the other side. The idea of abandoning the truck hurt. That old Ford had saved their lives more than once in the past couple of days. But cars needed gas, made noise, attracted attention. Maybe going on foot was smarter anyway. They loaded up with backpacks full of supplies, everyone carrying as much as they could. Marcus took the rifle and the shotgun, Jenny had the handgun, and Robert found a crowbar in the truck bed that he wielded like a weapon. Crossing that bridge was one of the most terrifying things Marcus had ever done, and that was saying something given the last 48 hours. The wooden planks were old and rotted in places, creaking under their weight. The river rushed below, dark and cold and full of rocks that would smash them to pieces if they fell. Emma was crying, terrified of heights, so her brother Tyler held her hand and talked her across step by step. Marcus went first, testing each plank before putting his full weight on it, the rifle slung across his back and his heart in his throat. They were halfway across when they heard it, that sound, the moaning and shuffling that meant zombies were nearby. Marcus looked back and saw them emerging from the tree line on the side they'd just left, drawn by their scent or sound or whatever the hell those things used to hunt. There were at least a dozen, stumbling onto the bridge behind them, and more coming out of the woods. Move, everyone move! Marcus shouted, and they did, scrambling across the rickety bridge as fast as they dared. A plank gave way under Robert's foot, and he nearly went through, but Tyler grabbed him and hauled him back up. The zombies were on the bridge now, their weight making the whole structure sway and groan. Marcus could hear metal screaming, bolts popping loose. The bridge wasn't going to hold much longer. They made it to the other side just as the first section of bridge collapsed, taking half a dozen zombies down into the river with a crash of metal and water. The rest of the zombies stopped at the gap, unable to figure out how to cross, just standing there swaying and moaning. Marcus bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. That was too close, way too close. But they'd made it. They were all still alive. Millbrook appeared through the trees about an hour later, and it was clear the town had seen hell and barely survived. Buildings were burned out, cars wrecked and abandoned, bodies in the streets that nobody had bothered to clear. But there were also signs of organized defense, barricades set up at intersections, empty shell casings glinting in the fading sunlight. People had fought here, and at least some of them had won. Morrison Airfield was on the north edge of town, and as they got closer, Marcus could see the fortifications. A proper wall made of shipping containers, concrete barriers, and chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Guard towers with actual soldiers holding actual military rifles. Spotlights sweeping the perimeter. It looked like something out of a war zone, which Marcus guessed it was. The war against the dead. They approached carefully, hands raised to show they weren't a threat. A soldier in the nearest tower spotted them and called down. "Stop right there. You been bit? Any of you injured?" Everyone shook their heads, holding still while more soldiers appeared on the wall, weapons trained on them. Marcus got it, they had to be careful, had to make sure they weren't letting infected people inside, but being on the wrong end of those rifles still made his stomach clench. "We heard the broadcast," Marcus called up. "Captain Morrison said this was a safe zone. We're just looking for shelter, maybe some food." The soldier studied them for a long moment, then spoke into a radio. A few minutes later, a gate made of welded metal and chain link swung open, and they were ushered inside by soldiers in full combat gear who looked like they hadn't slept in days. Inside the walls was like stepping into a different world. There were tents set up in rows, people moving around with purpose, kids playing in a cordoned-off area like everything was normal. Generators hummed, providing power for lights and what looked like a field hospital. A big cargo plane sat on the runway, painted with military markings, and soldiers were unloading supplies from it. Organization. Structure. Hope. A woman in a National Guard uniform approached them, her name tag reading Morrison. This had to be the captain from the broadcast. She looked tired, like everyone else, but she had kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Welcome to Morrison Airfield. I'm Captain Patricia Morrison. You folks made it through hell to get here, I'm guessing." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The relief was overwhelming, making his knees weak. They'd made it. They were actually safe. Captain Morrison led them to a processing tent where a medic checked everyone over, making sure nobody was hiding bites or infections. They were clean, all of them, just exhausted and traumatized and grateful to be alive. The captain explained the setup while they were being checked. The airfield was one of several safe zones being established across Pennsylvania. The military was working on clearing the major cities, establishing supply lines, and figuring out what the hell had caused the outbreak in the first place. "Is it everywhere?" Jenny asked the question they'd all been wondering. Captain Morrison's expression darkened. "From what we're hearing, it started on the East Coast and spread fast. Other countries are dealing with outbreaks too. It's bad, won't lie to you. But humanity's survived worse. We're fighting back, and we're winning, inch by inch." It wasn't exactly a rousing speech, but it was honest, and Marcus appreciated that more than false hope. They were assigned tent space, given MREs to eat, and clean water to drink. Actual food, actual safety, actual rest. That night, lying on a cot in a tent with Jenny in the cot next to him and the Fitzgerald family nearby, Marcus let himself finally process everything that had happened. Riverside was gone, Jake was gone, the life he'd known was gone. But he was alive. They were all alive. And as long as you were breathing, there was hope. Over the next few days, they settled into the rhythm of the airfield. Everyone had jobs, everyone contributed. Marcus found himself on wall duty, keeping watch for zombies or other threats. Jenny worked in the supply depot, helping organize and distribute resources. The Fitzgeralds stayed together, Robert helping with maintenance, Linda cooking in the mess tent, and Tyler and Emma doing whatever odd jobs needed doing. They were building something here, a community, a new start. More survivors trickled in every day, each with their own horror stories about how they'd escaped the outbreak. Marcus listened to all of them, storing away information, learning how to survive in this new world. The zombies were slow but relentless, attracted to noise and movement. Headshots were the only reliable way to put them down. The infection spread through bites, and once you were bit, you had maybe a few hours before you turned. Standard stuff from zombie movies, except this was real, and the stakes were life and death. 3 weeks into their stay at Morrison Airfield, Captain Morrison called a general assembly. Everyone gathered in the largest tent, maybe 200 survivors who'd made it to safety. The captain stood on a makeshift stage, her uniform crisp despite everything, and addressed the crowd. "Folks, I won't sugarcoat it. The world we knew is gone. But we're building something new, something better. The military is making progress clearing the major cities. We've got supply lines established with other safe zones. We're going to take back Pennsylvania, then the rest of the country, then the rest of the world. It's going to take time, and it's going to be hard, but we're going to make it. We're survivors, every last one of us, and survivors don't give up." The crowd erupted in cheers, people clapping and shouting, releasing weeks of pent-up fear and stress. Marcus found himself cheering too, caught up in the moment, in the hope of it all. Jenny grabbed his hand and squeezed, tears streaming down her face, and he squeezed back. They'd made it through the worst. The journey through the end times had tested them, changed them, shown them what they were capable of when everything was on the line. Later that night, Marcus stood on the wall, looking out at the dark forest beyond the airfield's lights. Out there, zombies were still wandering, still hunting, still dangerous. The world was still broken, still scary, still uncertain. But inside these walls, people were laughing, talking, planning for tomorrow. Kids were playing, couples were holding each other, families were together. Life was continuing, adapting, surviving. Marcus thought about Jake, about his mom who he hoped had made it to a safe zone somewhere, about Uncle Raymond whose cabin had probably saved their lives. He thought about the Marcus who'd woken up 3 weeks ago worried about shift schedules and tire money, and how that guy seemed like a stranger now. The apocalypse had come, the zombies had risen, and ordinary people like him had faced the threat and survived. Not because they were special or trained or prepared, but because they'd refused to give up, refused to lie down and die, refused to let the end be the end. The radio in the guard tower crackled to life, another broadcast from Captain Morrison going out to anyone who might be listening in the dark. "This is Morrison Airfield broadcasting to any survivors in the central Pennsylvania region. If you can hear this, we're here. We have food, shelter, and safety. You're not alone. Keep fighting, keep surviving, and make your way to us when you can. This is Captain Patricia Morrison signing off. Stay alive out there, folks. We're all in this together." Marcus smiled, adjusting the rifle on his shoulder. Yeah, they were all in this together. The journey through the end times wasn't over, probably wouldn't be over for a long time. But they'd faced the zombie threat and lived to tell the tale. They'd found other survivors, found hope, found a reason to keep going. And as long as they had that, as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. The world had ended, but humanity hadn't. And that made all the difference.